or people that, oh, sorry, that underlies colonialism.
Hi, everyone. The other concept we're going to be closely talking about, and covering, can you guys see the concept slide? Okay, yeah, is decolonization. If you aren't familiar with this term, we defined it as the cultural, psychological, and economic freedom for Indigenous people with the goal of achieving Indigenous sovereignty. And Indigenous sovereignty is the right and ability of Indigenous people to practice self-determination over their land, cultures, and political and economic systems. And we want to acknowledge that this is a fluid definition and it's up to interpretation, but that's how we defined it. So we'll dive into this later, but we wanted to give an overview for you all to keep in mind while we go through the presentation.
All right, there's the slide. Nice to meet you all. So before we get into the history of modern Earth Day, if people want to just type in the chat real quick, if anyone knows when and where modern Earth Day as we celebrate it today began. I'm just curious if anyone knows that. So I'm seeing a couple answers come in and you guys are right on. It was Santa Barbara in 1970. If I want to go to the next slide here. The first Earth Day was a response to the Santa Barbara oil spill that occurred in 1970, where 880,000 to 100,000 barrels of oil spilled into the Santa Barbara Channel over the course of 10 days. Made international news, national news, and paired with the growing activism and environmental concerns of the time. It was kind of a perfect scenario where Earth Day could get started. So then Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin ratified a national day. Oops, I didn't realize you couldn't read that last line. He ratified a national day dedicated to environmental education and policy change. This is what we now celebrate as Earth Day. So as you can see, the beginning of Earth Day was centered around environmental catastrophe. It was a response to environmental catastrophe and focused on legislative change, which is very important, but tends to ignore some of the other issues that can come up when talking about Earth Day. So next slide, please. So following Earth Day, or this first Earth Day, there was a large nationwide push to establish environmental legislation at all levels of government. Some of the big ones we know that are still in effect today are the Environmental Protection Agency, founded in 1970, the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1972, the Coastal Zone Management Act in 1972, the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and the Clean Air Act, which was originally passed in 1963, was considerably strengthened in 1970. And while these were huge strides for the government, for the United States as a whole, unfortunately, a lot of Indigenous groups were left out of these legislative initiatives. Some didn't qualify at all. Others had to essentially opt in to gain the benefits offered by these legislations that other Americans were given. Just initially, Indigenous groups had to do a couple extra steps to benefit from these. Next slide. And then also a big takeaway from this, a lot of these laws increased regulation and monitoring of public lands, of all lands, specifically public lands. And as a result of this, a lot of Indigenous groups lost the ability to hunt, fish, gather, and practice their traditions on their ancestral lands. So this just kind of, to me, speaks to the Western view that humans and nature cannot coexist. And so to preserve nature, you have to like, rope people out of it almost. And this is just a big failure on the United States government's part, and just kind of society as a whole in that time, to recognize Indigenous people's unique connection and relationship with the land that had existed for generations, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of years. And their failure to recognize that lot resulted in a lot of Indigenous people losing access to lands in the name of environmentalism, which is pretty sad. So on the next slide, you'll see, I'm just going to get into some details on two of the big legislations that followed the first Earth Day. So the EPA was established to essentially maintain environmental health around the country. It was established in 1970, but Indigenous people had to go through a process called treatment as a state to be included in the EPA, to get benefits from the EPA, but this wasn't an option until 1987. So there were 17 years in which Indigenous tribes were not protected by the EPA and didn't have the option to be protected by the EPA. And even today, there's a huge disproportion, there's a huge divide between the benefits seen by white communities versus the benefits seen by BIPOC communities by the EPA. So BIPOC people are disproportionately affected by pollutants, more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And then I've got some other stuff over here. Just BIPOC are more likely to be near oil drilling sites, have higher rates of asthma, suffer more economic distress from natural disasters. White communities are seen to have much more rebuilding efforts take place in their communities after natural disasters, whereas BIPOC don't see those, and so suffer financially more likely to live next to toxic waste sites, have higher rates of cancer, things like this. So just with these stats, we can see that the EPA, although came from Earth Day and was a response to environmental degradation, unfortunately does not protect United States citizens equitably or evenly. The same goes for the Clean Water Act, which I'll talk about on the next slide here. Yeah, if I can get the next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So also established right after the first Earth Day in 1972, went 15 years without the treatment as a state option. So 15 years in which Indigenous tribes were not protected. Oops, that was a typo. Weren't protected by the Clean Water Act. And then another divide, 58 out of 1,000 Native households lack plumbing compared with 3 out of 1,000 white households. That's a huge percentage, in my opinion. And then also BIPOC communities are much more likely not to have access to clean water. And I'm sure you all are up to date on the issues occurring in Flint, Michigan and Newark, New Jersey, where majority BIPOC communities don't receive the same benefits under the Clean Water Act that similar white communities would. So Barbara in the next section is going to dive more into those specific situations in Flint, Michigan and Newark, New Jersey, and I will hand that off to her. All right. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Hali. Great. So I'm going to go a little bit more into depth about some lived realities for BIPOC communities and go into some of the root causes about why there is such a disproportionate impact of environmentalism on white communities. Next slide, please. Great. So as we talked about earlier in this presentation, today's employs a legislative approach to climate change, especially when it comes to Earth Day. They're always asking you to sign petitions and call your officers and stuff like that. But legislation, it has very positive potential impact that is important in a green future. But there's a lot of drawbacks to legislation. It has not been radical enough to make meaningful change. We still find ourselves facing a climate crisis, and legislation has historically ignored frontline communities. One thing I wanted to pass over to you guys is this idea of frontline communities. If anyone can try to provide a definition or give an example. Can feel free to take yourself off mute or put it in the chat, whichever works. Okay, well, if we want to move on to the next slide, I can provide some definitions and some examples, and we can talk about it a little bit more. Next slide, please, Sierra. One working definition that I came up with from frontline communities from different sources that I found on the internet and through my work as an ES major was a community or a neighborhood that experiences more immediate and more significant impacts of climate change. This difference can come from a variety of distinctions that exist between communities, including amounts of greenery, levels of pollution, access to food, access to healthcare, and many others. These descriptions often come from systems of oppression that are much larger than the community itself. And this is a quote that I really liked. Just as climate change impacts ecosystems differently, communities experience various amounts of climate change. And these are some common frontline communities that we think of. And just keep some of these communities in mind when I'm talking about some of the root causes in the following slides. Next, Sierra. So overall, environmentalism today speaks to an audience that is wealthy and white and has a lot of privilege to be able to think about legislative approaches to climate change because historically that has served them. However, statistically, this demographic will experience the least severe impacts of climate change and will experience them slower. Frontline communities already experience a disproportionate amount of warming, and the impacts of climate change tend to hit them harder. Next slide, please. So as I brought up earlier, frontline communities, distinctions that make them frontline tend to stem from larger societal issues that the individuals themselves have no control over. Some common examples, but this is not a full list in any way, are slavery, white supremacy, colonialism, and xenophobia. And in environmentalism, it's very important that we acknowledge how societal structures of power that dictate individuals' futures in real life also apply to the environment and influence the outcomes. Next slide. This is one core issue that I came across when I was thinking about how frontline communities are made. Colonialism, as Lauren highlighted in the beginning of this presentation, is defined as a historical and ongoing global project which involves control by one power over a dependent area or people. And in the United States, colonialism has directly dispossessed land from the people indigenous to Turtle Island and continues to degrade the land across our country. Examples of this are overgrazing on federal lands, groundwater depletion, and the overall climate crisis that we find ourselves facing today. In addition to the impacts on land, colonialism significantly impacts the people indigenous to this land through genocide, and there has been significant loss of culture, language, and knowledge that continues to impact the community. Indigenous people also suffer disproportionate levels of alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide from the generational trauma that they carry. Next slide, please. Capitalism is another very large systemic issue that has impacted the state of our land and the state of our people. capitalism has driven the exploitation of natural resources, not only in the United States, but across the world. And these are some reports that I wanted to highlight. It's very difficult to casually talk about how capitalism has influenced climate change. So if you want to, I invite you to take a screenshot of these reports that I've found helpful. Driving Dispossessions, in particular from the Oakland Institute, goes through different case studies across the world about how communities are dispossessed of their land for different kinds of capitalist systems. Next slide, please. White supremacy also is something that is difficult to discuss generally. So I've chosen a couple examples of just how white supremacy has specifically driven the historic exploitation of people and of the planet, and how those tend to be tied together. White supremacy still impacts today's society, not only its people, but the land, and continues to drive exploitative behaviors across the world. One thing that I really wanted to point out is how white supremacy impacts our perception of who belongs in the outdoors. I think that's a really important thing to think about this Earth Day. It can feel like environmentalism and Earth Day and being outside is only for people who can afford it, or only for people who can feel safe outdoors. And that does a lot of harm in our society. Next slide, please. Similarly to white supremacy, the patriarchy has also really held us back in environmentalism. The patriarchy has kept in power those who have led us to the climate crisis, and continues to suppress the historical caretakers of this planet, which are Indigenous people and women and non-binary trans people. And I also think that the patriarchy has influenced our perception of who belongs in the outdoors and who environmentalism is for. And it's important that today we try to counteract, go against that narrative, and see that the outdoors are for all of us. Next slide, please. These are some statistics that I wanted to put up to kind of highlight how all of these different structures influence outcomes for climate change. You can see in a lot of these statistics, the ecosystems of systemic racism and discrimination that continue to oppress people who have been oppressed in the past. And next slide, please. Overall, we cannot look at climate change or at the state of the environment without looking at issues of colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Decolonizing environmentalism and Decolonizing Earth Day will not only better address these core issues, but it will allow us to restore our relationship with the earth and with each other. Thank you. I'm going to be passing it off to Ava now.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara, for sharing that with us. I'm going to now be talking specifically about decolonization, what it is and how we can practice it, and in particular, how we can merge the ideas of decolonization and environmentalism under one umbrella. Next slide, please. So the basic goal of decolonization is to deconstruct settler-imposed systems, systems that Barbara just talked about based on colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, these systems that continue to oppress Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And when thinking about all of this, I wanted to acknowledge that while this seems like an extremely daunting task, it is important to note that decolonization is a very long process that isn't going to happen overnight. But it's a process similar to grieving in that it takes a long time to heal and rebuild. But the main thing is that we are having these conversations and starting to talk about this change and trying to instigate change. So we feel that the first few steps towards decolonization is to practice mindfulness, or In other words, to decolonize your mind. This involves a lot of self-reflection and is a way to recognize settler-imposed systems and how they influence our everyday life. And then after starting this process of assessing and coming to terms with just how far-reaching and insidious colonization is, we can then quickly transition to tangible action, which recenters Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices, their sovereignty and futures. Next slide. So when thinking about mindfulness, I'm going to talk about how we can practice it and begin to decolonize our minds, like I said. So this can entail asking ourselves reflective questions such as, where does your family come from? And whose land do you travel, work, and live on? Many of us are taking up space on others' territory, which is often unceded, unsurrendered, and occupied land. I can share that I was born and raised on coastal Miwok territories, which were unceded, but growing up, this was something that I wasn't fully made aware of. In my younger education classes, the coastal Miwok tribes were mentioned, but I was never fully connected and was aware that I was on land that was never fully surrendered and that I was an occupant and a guest on that land. So just take a moment to consider these questions, and if anyone would like to share their background, that would be great, but no pressure. And of course, it's okay if you don't have the answers to these questions. That's why we're here talking about this right now. Okay, well, to answer some of those questions, we can look at this native land map, which is a crowdsourced map that documents Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages. So I think we're going to pull it up now.
I don't have the address memorized. Could you put it in the chat for me and I'll click on it? Thank you.
Lauren, just put it in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Lauren.
Feel free to check that out. And oh yeah, perfect. So I think it'd be interesting right now to look at Santa Barbara, where we're calling in from, and see the territories and then also the languages and treaties. So as you can see, it's where we're calling from, it's mostly unceded Chumash territory. And then we can also look at, there's the different sections of the map where you can look at the languages and then also the treaties, which show the cessions, the agreements, the formal agreements to give up land. And I thought it was really interesting looking at this map because it was actually kind of difficult for me to find where Santa Barbara was without the settler labels that they have. So yeah, I think this is just a really good resource for when you're traveling or in a new area to see the Indigenous people's territories, and you can practice perhaps like land acknowledgements. So yeah, just a really good resource. Okay. Thanks, Sierra, for navigating that. And now next slide. So I just want to acknowledge that for a while, it was difficult for me to reckon with and process, this history of colonization and like my position as a settler because of the associated guilt and shame. But guilt gets us nowhere. And while it's natural to feel this way, I wanted to emphasize that we can realize this history is not our fault, but then it is our responsibility moving forward to change. So even though this history has already happened and there's nothing we can do to change that, but we have to have the courage moving forward to face that and heal moving forward. Next slide. So action we can take is really important, because while I talked about the individual action and the work of decolonizing your mind and using those reflective questions, it's really important to quickly transition to doing tangible change that can readily deconstruct settler hierarchies, because while working to decolonize your mind and practicing mindfulness is an important aspect of decolonization, it's really just individual work, and it has the potential to recenter whiteness, extend settler innocence, and entertain a settler future, rather than focusing on actions that can actually ensure Indigenous futures and sovereignty and make change. Because like if we dwell too long on how we as settlers fit into the puzzle, we endanger the decolonization movement by forgetting that the movement is actually to be centered around Indigenous people. So with this in mind, action we can take includes asking permission. This can take the form of asking Indigenous people for permission to be on their traditional land, perhaps when planning marches or events, and then also include them in planning, which can shift inherent settler entitlement. And then we can also actively engage with local movements spearheaded by Indigenous, Brown, or Black communities and build relationships with those in these movements. And then in addition, we can work for repatriations of land, upholding treaties, and funding Indigenous-led struggles and efforts for land return. Okay, next slide.
Great, thanks, Ava. So now I'm going to be talking about what decolonized environmentalism looks like. So just a bit of background, colonial and capitalistic worldviews have eradicated Indigenous values of balance, reciprocity, responsibility, and spiritual connection to the land. And so by decolonizing, we will inherently be helping the environment. So for centuries, conservation has been driven by Eurocentric structures that emphasize this separation between man and nature, as Hali was talking about earlier. And this ideology doesn't belong to Indigenous communities. So before colonialist conquest, the overwhelming consensus throughout the world was that human beings were just a small part of the natural world, neither detached nor superior. And this underlying environmental ideology remains that human beings are, and to some extent, connected to all living things on Earth, even to the Earth itself. Can I just have the next slide? So I thought this quote really encapsulates why it's important to fight for Indigenous lands. And it says, although they comprise less than 5% of the world population, Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity in the forests, deserts, grasslands, and marine environments in which they have lived for centuries. So I think the most important first step to decolonizing one's understanding of environmentalism is learning about the struggles that Indigenous people face in advocating for the health of the environment and acknowledging the long shadow that colonialism has left on the environment. Next slide, please.
So what decolonization and environmentalism can actually look like in action is knowing where our heat, water, electricity, and then just any other resources in our daily lives come from, because Indigenous communities are the most affected by extractive industries, which are imposed on their land by settler states. So just keeping this in mind is really important. And then in addition, we can provide equal opportunity to Indigenous, Black, and Brown voices in environmental conservation and climate movements. Like Barbara highlighted, due to historic exclusion and alienation, this requires combating stereotypes of environmentalists as primarily white through consciously inviting non-white, non-European cultures into conservation. And then through this diverse community-based management, we can uplift traditional ecological knowledge, which is really important for monitoring and combating climate change, and just overall environmental health. And this can be a way to break down the colonial barrier between nature and humanity that has been established for so long. And then finally, we can support local movements led by frontline communities. The environmental justice movement is not reflective of Indigenous ways of understanding land and human relations with it. So we can work to uplift and hear Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices in the environmental movement.
So with all that being said, we wanted to share some positive Indigenous news on projects which are broadly working towards decolonisation of the land and environmentalism. So I have 2 stories to share. So while I'm sharing about my 2 stories, please have a think or Google any positive stories you found recently, and I'll come back to it after I share these ones. So the first one that I found was that following 3 months of fundraising, the Save the San Marcos Foothills campaign announced on June the 8th, 2021, that it had reached its $18.6 million goal to purchase the San Marcos Foothills West Mesa from the Chadma Group. And this is significant because they plan to develop luxury homes on the 101-acre West Mesa property, and they were able to halt this, and instead the land has been added to 200 acres of the San Marcos Foothills Preserve. And this area is one of the largest and most productive grasslands in Santa Barbara County. And according to the Channel Islands Restoration, they've been performing habitat restoration on the preserve and the surrounding undeveloped area since 2010. And this has all been achieved through demonstrations and the generosity of over 5,500 donors. And it's also important to acknowledge that that they're creating 300 acres of wildlife habitat, and the campaign aims to include members of the Chumash community in the planning, stewardship, and uses of the land, and support future Chumash rituals and ceremonies on this area. Next slide, please. And another news story that we found was that Governor Gavin Newsom proposes $100 million for Native American tribes to purchase and preserve their ancestral lands. So these funds will go towards tribal-led initiatives that advance shared climate and conservation goals. And the California Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, emphasizes that the administration is committed to developing a structure or a process where tribes are deciding where these funds are going. And although it is a good start, it should also be argued that this funding won't be enough for all the 109 federally recognized tribes in California, for them to be able to buy back their land. And in some cases, these tribes have competing claims over the same land, so deciding who would get the money to purchase would be quite difficult. So in this news article that I read, they suggest that it would be great to see the funding in San Francisco specifically dedicated to local tribes and urban American Indians, so that they have the ability to participate in traditional land stewardship and conservation on more of a local level. So these are my 2 stories. If anyone has any stories they've read recently or they've just found, please feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. It would be great to hear some positive news. Oh, I see one from Instagram.
I'll share. I actually just
great.
saw yesterday that CSUCI now has an Indigenous Studies program that is being started and funded. It's like their first program there at CSUCI. So I think that's a great win. We'll see how they actually like work in Indigenous knowledge. I feel a little funny about capitalizing on that, but all to say there's resources being put there.
I mean, that's great news.
Yes.
Yeah, Daniel, did you want to go?
Yeah, I added a link for an acquaintance that works with kind of decolonized textile work and saving that ancestral knowledge. And he posted recently that he was able to, while giving a presentation, bring his mom, who is where he gets a lot of his ancestral Indigenous knowledge, and they incorporated not just the textile but also like medicinal work, and it's just that's how like we can continue doing the work by preserving the ancestral knowledge that that is brought down, and it's just really beautiful to see that opportunity for him.
Great, thanks for sharing. I think we had one more in the chat. Oh, we have two more in the chat. But just for time, thank you so much for sharing. And feel free to have a look at them. So can we just have the next slide, please? So to finish, the big question of how do we decolonize Earth Day, just to summarize everything that we've learned this hour. Next slide, please. So I think from everything that we've heard today, it's really important that we uplift Indigenous voices, both where we reside and across the nation, and learn about the people Indigenous to our area, as Ava was talking about, their cultures and practices, and learn about their native plants as well. And honor is the first step at creating a relationship with the natural world around us, and for us to begin decolonizing our understanding of nature. And so secondly, there are calls for a community rights-based conservation, which refers to culturally appropriate conservation initiatives. And this is supported through self-determination and collective agency of communities granted through the secure and inalienable collective tenure rights over their traditional lands. And this strategy accounts for the historical context of rights recognition and dispossession in the country in which they are enacted, and it actively counters existing frameworks that hinder rights and recognition by implementing reforms through inclusive processes. And finally, I think it's important we share resources with others and keep this conversation going. I think it's great that all of us are here today. And to finish, here are some extra resources to continue working towards a decolonized understanding of environmentalism. So we have some books here. Feel free to screenshot, but we will also be sending out this presentation for you to look back on. Next slide, please. We also have some list of music here. Next slide. Yeah, and we just want to say a big thank you to everyone, and feel free to ask any questions, and I'm going to hand back over to Sierra.
Thank you so much to you all, Ava, Lauren, Hali, Barbara. That was fantastic. Thank you, thank you. Just wondering if we could get a round of applause maybe, or in any form. You did so great. Thank you so, so much. How do I want to finish? I think this was really reflective for me, and I really appreciate the time. You know, it's maybe 50 minutes that we spent together, and I was just really able to reflect on my own relationship with land and Indigenous folks personally, so thank you. I thought we could finish with a collective breath. So on the count of 3, if we could all just breathe in together. 1, 2, 3, in and out. Yes, please get your questions in the chat, but if you would like to unmute, you can also ask your questions out loud. Do you have any questions for Ava, Lauren, Hali, or Barbara? Any questions? All right, you're just all getting a lot of thank yous. All right, then, if we don't have any questions, you can or if you have questions later on, you can send them to me at the saticoidepot@gmail.com or Pinaysphere at pinaysphere@gmail.com. Again, I'm going to remind everyone that we have 2 more events in this series. They're both going to be in person at the Saticoid Depot Farm, which is towards the east end of Ventura, and we would love to see you there. And if you could please let us know that you're coming, that would be greatly appreciated. And you can just send Pinaysphere an email to update your registration if you haven't already registered. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.